The left hemisphere's already decided what it's interested in, and it only notices the things it's already interested in. So it's committed to the certain things it will find, and it never, as it were, gets surprised by that, unless it just makes a mistake. Whereas the right hemisphere is attentive to everything without any preconception about what that might be. Now, that is very, very important, this difference in attention, because in effect, the way we attend to the world governs what it is we find there.
Welcome to the Bounce Podcast. I'm Larry Weeks. In this episode, we dive into the fascinating world of the brain's hemispheres and the profound impact they have on how we perceive and engage with reality. My guest is Dr. Iain McGilchrist. Iain is a true polymath. He's a psychiatrist, neuroscientist, philosopher, and literary scholar. He's been a fellow at All Schools College at Oxford and is currently an associate fellow at Green Templeton College. He's also a fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists and previously served as the clinical director at the Bethlem Royal Maudsley Hospital in London. He's been a research fellow in neuroimaging at Johns Hopkins and was a fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Stellenbosch. He is also the author of a number of groundbreaking books, but is best known, I think, for The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World, and then his monumental 2-volume work, The Matter with Things, Our Brains, Our Delusions, and the Unmaking of the World. Iain contends that the way the two hemispheres of the brain operate is fundamentally distinct. And it's not that the hemispheres handle different functions, but that they approach these functions in entirely different ways. Why is this important? Because, and according to Iain, these differences shape how we think, how we relate, and even how we build societies. When one hemisphere dominates, it influences our worldview, and often with profound consequences for our personal and collective lives. At the individual level, recognizing when your thinking is more left or right brain dominant might allow you to cultivate balance. By consciously shifting focus and engaging both hemispheres, we might better navigate challenges, relationships, and opportunities that come our way. So in this episode, we explore the surprising role of the brain's hemispheres, and Iain explains why they are divided. He talks about how attention shapes our reality and what this means for our lives. He discusses the dangers of left hemisphere dominance and its impact on modern society, why meaning, beauty, and truth are discoveries, not inventions. We talk about the interplay of reason, intuition, imagination, even science, and understanding the world. We explore the idea that consciousness may be the fundamental fabric of reality, which we also explored on this show in other conversations, Christoph Koch specifically. We talk about the tension between mechanism and life and why it matters. And Iain shares his thoughts on AI and argues that the greater risk may not be that AI becomes human-like, but rather humans are becoming more machine-like. Great conversation. I thought Iain's ability to weave neuroscience, history, philosophy, even poetry into a compelling thesis is really unparalleled. I really enjoyed talking with him. And I think you'll find this chat very, very interesting. So without further ado, here is Iain. Where do we find you?
Where I'm to be found less often than I would like, which is at home on the Isle of Skye.
I don't know why I thought you were in LA or... It sounds like you travel a lot.
Too much, yes.
Yeah, okay.
I've just been in Japan. That might be what it was.
Have you been to Japan many times or before?
No, I never have. And it wasn't for once because I had to sing for my supper. I went because I'm interested in Japan. My grandfather lived in Japan before the First World War, and as a child, I was quite close to him, and he told me the most extraordinary and wonderful stories of Japan and brought back many beautiful objects from Japan, and they've really excited my imagination. And now that I'm nearly dead, I thought I really must go to Japan.
Wow. The reason I asked is because it's been a dream of mine to go to Japan. I was in the 80s into everything Japanese. I studied Aikido and I studied the language, and I got a teaching job. I got a job teaching English in Nagoya.
Oh, wow.
I bought a ticket and I just broke up with a girlfriend and I was just having a life crisis. And I got on the plane and I never made it. I turned around in Texas, and regretted it ever since. But you still recommend it?
I think it's an astonishing place. I'm in awe of it. I'm also quite clear that I don't want to live there. Let's put it that way. And quite what it must have been like for my grandfather, only in his 20s, leaving England. Only communication was, a train that would take a letter, every so often to the woman that he was engaged to and who became his wife and my grandmother. And the story has a happy ending. But it must have been very disconcerting for him because, of course, nowadays we're prepared by all kinds of images and films and the internet, and we have an idea of what Japan is. But he was a lad from industrial Lancashire. He'd no idea.
Must have been like another planet.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. In fact, I'm told that in the local newspaper, there was a picture of him and an article that said, Mr. Kenyon leaves for Japan. So there we are.
So thank you so much for coming on. And I want to make good use of our time here. And what I hope to, let me just give you an overview of what I hope to accomplish, however poorly on my part. And that is, so I've read your books. They're fantastic. I'm going to point the audience to them and link them in the show notes and resources. But some of them they're tomes. They're fairly large books, and it takes some time to get through. But they were very profound. And I'm coming from this, Iain, I meditate and I'm exploring my consciousness. I'm trying to live a better life in I should say a better internal life, maybe. Which comes first, chicken or the egg? But so what I'd like to do is try to get from you a way to distill your ideas into an applicable, how does this affect my life? What do I do? And then what now? And then I'm going to ask, what do we do with this? So we're going to talk about the divided brain and its relevance to just how we conceive of ourselves in the world. But could you describe the phenomena itself and how we've come to know anything about it, the divided brain?
Interestingly, people have suspected there were differences between the two brain hemispheres since the 3rd century BC in Greece. So it's not it's just a thunderbolt has come to us. And of course, the question arises, why is the brain divided at all? I mean, for those who haven't seen a brain, it looks rather like a walnut. It's got a big division down the middle and it's sort of wrinkly around the sides. And, this organ depends on making connections. That is its power, the number of connections between neurons. So why waste so much power by dividing it? And why are the two halves of the brain asymmetrical? If you just wanted more computing power, surely you could just expand it symmetrically. But the two halves of the brain are asymmetrical. The hemispheres are broader at the back on the left and broader at the right on the front. And there's a bigger expansion in both those areas, in those two hemispheres. And a further puzzle, which I was struck by when I was doing medical training, because I came to medicine somewhat late, I should say. I had a fellowship at Oxford in literary matters, and I felt compelled, for reasons we can go into if you want, but to study medicine and to get to know more about how the brain affects our approach to the world. But anyway, this thing that struck me in my training was that the band of fibers that joins the two hemispheres at their base, known as the corpus callosum, is very largely inhibitory in its function. So you've got a puzzle here. The brain needs to work together, but it also seemingly needs to work in two parts quite separately. Why? I think the answer to this is, and nobody has come up with a better idea, and as far as I know, it remains unchallenged. We can see this in animals, we can see it through evolution, and we can see it in the human brain. It's how to solve the conundrum of survival. How do you eat and stay alive? That doesn't sound particularly difficult in 2024 in the West. But in fact, if you're an animal, you have to be able to grab stuff very precisely, very quickly, very deftly, ahead of any competitor. So if you see something you want to eat, you have to be able to go and get it. And for this, you need a kind of detail, focused attention to one little part of the 360 degrees, perhaps only 3 degrees out of the whole 360 is where your attention is focused. But of course, you couldn't survive if you just did that, because while you were busy trying to get something for your lunch, you'd become another creature's lunch. You need to be looking out for predators. You need to be looking out for your mate, for your kin, for your conspecifics, for your offspring. You need to be globally attentive to the world in order to understand it. But you also need to be able to focus attention on a detail in order to be able to manipulate it. In very few words, that is, and you know that I've written about this at enormous length, that is the key difference. Now, why is that a significant difference? When I first realized that there was this attentional difference, which, by the way, is undisputed. I mean, you won't find anybody.
And this is across mammals and other animals.
It's across not only mammals, it applies to reptiles, birds, even fish. And to some extent, we think, although they don't really have brains as such, but they have neural ganglia to some insect forms. So there is always a difference in living things between these two asymmetrical parts of the substance, the organ that brings you to attend to the world and gives you consciousness of it, awareness of it.
And I'm simplifying, but just one is kind of very focused, kind of detailed attention, and then the other side is the bigger picture, pulling it all together.
Yeah.
Oversimplifying.
Yeah.
Okay.
One has very piecemeal attention to this and that and the other, which it's constantly attracted to because it thinks it wants it. And so its attention is piecemeal, divided, sharply focused on a detail. But the right hemisphere's attention is broad, open, sustained over time, and vigilant. In other words, it's on the lookout for things. The left hemisphere's already decided what it's interested in, and it only notices the things it's already interested in. So it's committed to the certain things it will find, and it never, as it were, gets surprised by that, unless it just makes a mistake. Whereas the right hemisphere is attentive to everything without any preconception about what that might be. Now, that is very, very important, this difference in attention, because in effect, the way we attend to the world governs what it is we find there. I sometimes find it useful to give an example from where I live. I live at a place with a huge mountain behind it, and its name is derived from a Norse word meaning the sloping rock. Now, what does that tell us? It tells us that 1,000 years ago, Norsemen came down this part of the coast of Scotland, and they knew this as a landmark. It was an important landmark because right here, there is a bay with treacherous rocks, and it was a place that would be given to shipwreck. So to be able to see where we are, that was the purpose of the mountain. It was a landmark. But to the Picts who'd been here for 1,000 years before that, it was the home of the gods, as well as providing shelter from the fierce elements, because they built their homes in the lee of it. And then in the 18th century, people came here to paint, and they drew and painted this picture and engraved it of, a many-textured, many-colored form. So to them, it was something beautiful in an aesthetic sense. In the 19th century, people came to look at it because it happens to be an outstanding example, one of the best in the world, of columnar basalt. And so for them, it was a geological phenomenon. That very fact means that to a speculator, it could mean dollars, because they could destroy the mountain by mining it. So for them, it could mean riches. But to a physicist, what is that mountain? It's 99.99% nothing. And the other 0.01% is, well, we don't really know what. So which of these is the real mountain? And the answer is they are all the real mountain. There is no one single mountain. There are many ways of attending to it. And the way in which you attend to it and the interest you have in it governs what you will find there.
So left brain, right brain. It seems in your writings, in your thesis, that the right hemisphere is superior in many ways to the left. I could be parsing this wrong.
No, you're not.
Okay. So why is that?
Okay, it depends on whether you're interested in simply using the world or knowing what it's like. So if you just want to use the world, a map will do fine. It tells you how to get from A to B. But if you built up your picture of the world from a map, you wouldn't know anything about the world. You wouldn't know anything about the fact that there are, billions of growing things there. There are families, there are feuds, there are, whatever there is going on. So a map is just the most minimal skeletal diagram of what it is it's representing. And it's not a problem that it is like that. It wouldn't be better if it had more information. Its power comes from having little information. Now, you can imagine that the left hemisphere has very little information compared with the right. It's not really in the business of understanding. It's just in the business of exploiting, manipulating, grabbing, and getting. And as a result, it has a picture of the world which is totally unrealistic, that it's made up of isolated things, that it already knows what they are, so it's certain about them. They are static, they're fixed by this gaze so that they can grab them and get them quickly. Those things are explicit, it's very obvious what they are. Their nature is to be, if you like, inanimate. They're not living things. They are representations of living things. So, and at the same time, the right hemisphere has a quite different picture. It sees that, in fact, nothing is ultimately unconnected to everything else, that nothing is fully certain. It doesn't mean we don't know what's going on. We do up to a point, but we can never be 100% certain of reality. These things are always flowing and changing. They're not static. They're in process. Their power is often implicit. They need to be understood in the round, in a context. The left hemisphere has decontextualized what is seen by ripping it out of the context and saying, oh, I see, it's one of those. I'll put it in a box here. I've already got a box of those. I know exactly what it is. The right hemisphere is able to see that, no, this maybe looks like other things, but it could be something different. And indeed, everything is finally unique, and it's able to see the uniqueness of things. The left hemisphere only sees the generalities of things. The right hemisphere sees the embodied, embedded, contextualized reality. The left hemisphere sees an abstracted diagram or a diagrammatic representation of reality. So in the right hemisphere, you've got the presence. I like to say that reality presences, making it a verb as Heidegger did. It comes into being for us through our attention, whereas the left hemisphere already knows what it is. It's got a map of it and end of story. So the left hemisphere knows so little that it thinks it knows everything. This is why it's dangerous. It's got quite a lot of power, and it can completely derail the way one is looking at the world unless one is aware of this problem. And one sees a presence with the right hemisphere, but only a representation in the left, which literally means being present again after the event when, in fact, it's no longer present.
So we know this from split brain experiments and stroke victims, I'm assuming, but is it Gazzaniga who called the left hemisphere the interpreter? I think you actually called it the bullshitter.
Yes. Well, actually, Gazzaniga would agree with me that it's a bullshitter.
So tell me why it's the bullshitter.
One, I think, very interesting observation is that when people have injuries to the brain and have a delusional disorder as a result, it is almost always after there's been damage to the right hemisphere, not to the left, because the right is our anchor in reality. The left hemisphere doesn't really know very much. And so it's quickly deluded. It's prone to hallucinating. It is not reliable. In the old ghastly pop psychology split between left and right, left was boring but reliable and insightful, whereas the right hemisphere was kind of off on some
creative,
creative, but a bit kind of airy-fairy.
And a lot of people talk about, oh, you're right brain, left brain, and it's oversimplification. Yeah.
Well, it certainly is if you think of it in those terms, and it generally is an oversimplification, yes, to say left brain or right brain only, because they both work together on everything. So the old idea that the left did this and the right did that is wrong, because they both do everything. They just do them in a completely different way, consistently. So the left hemisphere does this breaking up into bits and saying, oh, now I've got it. And the right hemisphere sees, oh, okay, if we shift the context, this is something completely different. So there's a much more complex vision of what's going on. So the left hemisphere is, and this is not just me that says it, but I can think of at least two other neurologists who've actually produce the same formulation. The left hemisphere is effectively deluded. And that's what we mean by bullshitting, because it's not deluded in the sense that it doesn't know and sort of just makes something up. It doesn't know that it doesn't know, and it just sort of makes something up. You see, if only it had insight that it didn't know very much, it would be a little bit more tentative and would go, I don't really know. Let me see if the right hemisphere knows something about this. But actually, the left hemisphere is immediately sure that it's got it, even when it hasn't a bloody clue.
It's shameless, Ian.
It's shameless.
By the way,
shameless.
I know we just had an election.
No, you don't say.
No. So there were some experiments, correct, where a subject was asked to do some kind of task that the left hemisphere wasn't aware of. And when they asked the subject who was answering from the left hemisphere, I'm screwing this up, but it made up the reason.
That's right. It would take a little while to give the exact
I was
story
trying
of
to
that. But the take-home message is that when the left hemisphere doesn't understand, which in split brain patients under certain circumstances can be engineered, that the input to the right and left hemisphere is distinct. In you and me, that doesn't really work, because as soon as either hemisphere has got information, it does a transfer about it. But when there's a separation, the right hemisphere may well know something and therefore act logically on the consequences of it. And the left hemisphere is watching its body do something. It doesn't know what it is. And instead of saying, well, I don't know why I'm doing that, it says, oh, it's because of this. And it makes up some plausible crap. I mean, it really is like this. And to just bring home to people how bad this unawareness of what it is going on can be, a common consequence of a right hemisphere stroke is a paralysis in the left side of the body, the left arm, say, or the left leg, or both, the whole side of the body. Patients who've had this very often deny that there's anything wrong. So although they're paralyzed, they will maintain that, no, they can move their limbs. So if you say, could you move your left arm for me? They will say there, but nothing actually moves. If you bring the left arm round in front of them and say, move that, they then go, oh, that's not my arm, doctor. It's yours, or it's that patient's over there. In other words, they're completely out of touch with reality. Now, when you put together the fact that I believe that the way the world is going, and I'm cutting corners here enormously, but let's just do that for the sake of getting a message across. If the world is going further and further into a kind of tyranny of the left hemisphere's view, the fact that the left hemisphere effectively knows very little about reality is quite worrying, because it's also the one that goes around grabbing and destroying and doing stuff because it thinks it needs things. Does this ring any bells?
Boy, oh boy. So moving into the so what, before we go further, because, and it's your thesis in your books, I believe, that the modern world is increasingly dominated by the left hemisphere thinking, and this will contribute to various social, psychological challenges and mental health issues, which I want to talk about, because I'd like to get to the collective. I'd like to back up to the individual and say, how can we either practice whole brain thinking or become aware of left brain dominance or what have you? Because they work together. It's important, right? Because they're good together. Sure. And we're not saying you're better without the left hemisphere. No. And I assume then, Ian, that what would get in the way of me playing a good game of tennis is a critic or something that's just barking at me. And I'm assuming maybe that's the left hemisphere?
Basically, no, I'm afraid.
All right.
Okay.
No, that's please.
No, I mean, unfortunately, a game of tennis is not a very good way of unpicking what the difference between the hemispheres is. Because when you're in the middle of a game, a lot of stuff is going on from a level below consciousness, in which both hemispheres and neither hemisphere are involved. And obviously, from a motor point of view, if you're right-handed and you're holding the racket with your right hand, there's a lot of motor control going to that right hand from the left hemisphere. But we can't go really much further than that with it. So what might help is, may I just suggest that we think very briefly about the ways in which societies have shifted. Okay. So in the second half of The Master and His Emissary, I'm bold enough or foolish enough to look at the history of the West from the ancient Greeks forward to postmodernism and look at the main changes in the history of ideas over that period. And what I effectively see is 3 times a civilization flourishing in the 6th century BC in Greece, around the year dot in Rome, and around the 15th, 16th century in Europe with the Renaissance. And at these moments, there is a sudden uprising of the 2 hemispheres working very well together, complementing one another, with the left hemisphere always working under the tutelage, the supervision, the oversight of the right hemisphere, because it's the right hemisphere is the master in the title, The Master and His Emissary, the one that really sees it. And the left hemisphere is the servant, and it can carry out certain tasks. It thinks it knows everything, but it doesn't, but at least it can do certain things quickly and efficiently that the right hemisphere doesn't want to get bogged down in. It's like, I don't want to do calculation. I could do lots of calculations that computer will do for me, but it would take me a squillion times longer than just letting the computer do it. But the computer doesn't understand what it's doing. So it's very useful as a servant, but it shouldn't be calling the shots. Now, over the course of the Western civilization, we've had 3 times where a civilization has built up from this working together very well to a relentless erosion of the right hemisphere's place in this by the overweening desire of the left hemisphere for power and control. And in each case, we've seen a civilization go from something that is enormously creative, society flourishes in which they live in harmony with the living world, with the natural world, through to an arrogant position in which things begin to ossify, become over-hierarchical, they become samey, everything becomes rather bureaucratic effectively. So that instead of seeing people, you see numbers and digits and categories, you see algorithms and so on. The bane of life nowadays, where nobody can do anything as an individual anymore because you've got to be pushed through various algorithms. So that is where we've got to since the Enlightenment. Now, there's nothing wrong, let me be clear, with the Enlightenment in itself. And if I'd been alive at the time, I'd probably have been very much in that movement. But the fact is, it's an arrogant, hubristic movement because it suggests that we really can understand and control everything. But in fact, there's very little that we understand. And when we try to control things, we often make them much worse.
What is your theory as to why that happened? So we're making the Enlightenment, we're making these discoveries, science is mathematics, and is it a form of logical overreach?
You could put it that way. In the second of the 3 parts of The Matter with Things, my 2021 publication, which is really my latest and I think last word on this whole topic, I'm really trying to explore how can we know anything? And in the middle part, I say, after we've looked at the difference between the hemispheres and their ability to give us a real contact with the world rather than fantasy, we need to be able to progress towards truth by some sort of path. What might be those paths? I suggest that they are science, reason, intuition, and imagination. And nowadays, everybody's clear that science and reason are important, but then they're not aware of the crucial role of intuition and imagination. So that education has become very routine matter of teaching people procedures, shoving facts into them, rather than enabling them to think more critically, more broadly, more openly about the picture of the world and to understand it. This used to be delivered by what we call the humanities. You know, the key is in the word, humanity. It tells us something about what we're doing here. Whereas maths and science won't answer those questions. It's not that I think they're incredibly important. I champion science, I champion reason. People often say, your work is very full of science and rationalizing and so on. Well, okay, it is. But I hope it's also full of imagination. And sciences and maths have made their great discoveries through intuition and imagination. Very few great discoveries have been made simply by the inductive method of following procedure. That is necessary at some stage, but then there has to be imaginative insight. So we need all of these things in order to be able to, we don't need just one or two, we need all of them in order to be able to assess how we can understand the world. And each of them has its limitations. So there are limitations and strengths to each one of those 4: science, reason, intuition, and imagination.
So you say that because of the left brain dominance that we've lost all sense of meaning of our world. Could you elaborate on that? What do you mean we've lost meaning? I think you say that the left hemispherical world is reflexive. It refers internally, not outwards.
It tends to be like a map or a diagram or a two-dimensional representation of reality. It tends to lack the depth of reality, and it refers to itself. So it knows what it knows, and it's hard for it to break out of what it thinks it knows. So each of science and reason can get stuck in a position where it calls things irrational or unscientific just because they go beyond science and reason. Is the greatest music that was ever written irrational? No, it's supra-rational. It's above reason. It can't be simply reduced to logical propositions. And all the things that really matter to us and make life worth living, like love, friendship, sex, our relationship with the natural world, poetry, music, art, architecture, ritual, myth, metaphor, religious faith, all these things are beyond being encompassable simply by everyday language and the process of reasoning. That's why we have the arts. That's why we have poetry. It can say things that can't be simply reduced to a prose paraphrase. And so this part of our understanding of the world is critically important because it puts us in touch with the meaning of being alive, what it means to be in this world, what this world is like, what a human being is doing here. Now, I know that those who are hardened reductionists will say there is no meaning. Everything is meaningless. It's pointless. We just invent meaning to cheer ourselves up. That is a dogmatic belief. I mean, they're entitled to have unchallenged dogmas if they like, but they can't prove that that's the case. They assume that that's the case. And it turns out to be a very poor assumption. It actually stops you seeing almost everything important in the bigger picture of life. So we need, of course, reason and we need science, but we need them to have a degree of humility about how far they can go. And I have to say that the greatest scientists, like most of the great physicists of the last century, but throughout history, have been much more modest than many of the modern, less perhaps inventive and less intelligent proponents of scientism, the belief that science can tell us everything. I just want to make the point that value, things like goodness, beauty, and truth, are the things that give meaning to life, and they are there for us to discover, not to invent. We don't invent them. We either discover them or fail to discover them during the time we have here. And I think the purpose of our life is to see them, to discover them, to reflect them back to the cosmos, and to enlarge them, to grow them, to make them more potent.
I was thinking if you take away poetry and music and, the arts, it's almost like what is left? What kind of living is that? You also made me think of, there's a book by, I think it's Harmut Rosa about resonance. And his views seem very similar because he says our relation to the world is not one of control. You can't nail it down. It's not that controllable. He said you kind of move with it. We're part of it. We're in relationship versus some kind of war with it.
Life is not a theorem to be solved. Life is a dance to be enjoyed.
I want to ask you about the psychological mental health challenges of left hemisphere dominance. And I'm not talking about necessarily a damaged brain. I'm just talking about the psychology of it, because you have this interesting background, and correct me where I'm wrong, but theology and philosophy, and then you got into medicine. You were in clinical practice. Is that right, in psychiatry?
Yes.
So tell me then, what is this mental health challenges for left hemi dominance? Is there a certain cycle of isolation, overthinking, or some kind of emotional disconnect?
I think there are two things. I think the thing that you're probably wanting me to talk about is the enormous rise in anxiety, depression, and mental disorders of one kind or another in society. And this is not just an impression, it's something that we know to be a fact, that people are less happy now than they were. They are more likely to be prone to thoughts of suicide or self-harm and contend with powerful negative thoughts a lot of the time. And, just in brief, there are data banks of people, cohorts of people from the 1930s onwards, in which they were asked the same questions at the same stage in their life about how happy they were, how fulfilled they were, whether they felt lonely, whether they felt their life had meaning. And it has, nowadays, there are 5 times as many teenagers reporting noticeable mental conditions, 5 to 8 times the number in the 1930s. So there's no doubt that there is an epidemic of unhappiness and of mental illness. In fact, there is another element, and I'll just deal with it quickly because it's not, I think, the bit that you're so interested in for now, but is very interesting, which is that there are some mental conditions that one way of looking at them is that they involve not just, but they involve an underactive right hemisphere and an overactive left hemisphere. And the two that spring to mind are schizophrenia and autism in their different ways. They often seem to involve an inability to be able to see what it is the right hemisphere normally offers. And instead, there is an over-calculating way of trying to understand it using the left hemisphere. So what we don't actually see is necessarily a rise in schizophrenia. It's argued that we see a rise in autism. We certainly see many more people diagnosed with autism, but that may be an artifact of our being more aware of it, more willing to diagnose it, and so on. In the past, such people may just have been thought of as somewhat eccentric. So I don't know exactly about that, but what I do know is that there is an overwhelming sense of futility in society, which gives rise to the opposite of mental well-being and of the experience of a fulfilled life.
Could one be aware of left hemisphere dominance?
I think you can. And I don't mean this to sound, there's no way of saying this without sounding like, well, read my book. But the thing is this, that I know as a psychiatrist that if you're going to help people, you have to show them, first of all, what it is that they're doing wrong. It's no good saying, do this. They won't know why to do it, and they probably won't bother to follow through. But you need, first of all, to help them see what it is they're doing that is unhelpful. And when people read The Master and His Emissary, or even more, The Matter with Things, a very common reaction is, I see how I've been living. I see what I've been mistakenly thinking.
It's insight. It's
insight.
Yeah.
And without insight, you can't get anywhere by just telling people do this, do the other. You need that insight. Right. And once people have that insight, they no longer really need a great deal of directive.
There's an awareness now.
There's an awareness.
Okay.
And living in that awareness makes you see. A very common other reaction is, once you see this hemisphere difference, you can see it everywhere in our lives, because it's not just, as it were, in a clinic, it's everything. So we tend to be too black and white in our thinking. The left hemisphere likes either or. It's quick and dirty. Unlike, again, the image in the bad old days when people thought the left hemisphere was, sound in judgment. It isn't. Remember, it's the one that's trying very quickly to grab something. So it hasn't got time to go, well, it might be this, it might be that. It's got to go, it's what I need, and get it. Whereas the right hemisphere is more, as Ramachandran, B.S. Ramachandran, a distinguished neuroscientist, says, the right hemisphere is the devil's advocate. It's the one that's going, actually, it might not be what you think it is. That's also quite important to know. But anyway, my point is that we have gone in for this either-or mentality, that it's fully this or it's fully that. Now, almost nothing I know in the world is like that. Almost everything is a matter of a degree. And sometimes a small degree of something is very good, but making more and more of it happen makes things worse. And even things that we think of as bad in very small amounts may actually be rather good and healthful. So this black and white thinking, this either or thinking, is very unhelpful. It leads to extreme positions. It leads to typical left hemisphere, I'm right and you can't challenge me because I know. And people get aggressive and angry, which is very much the mindset of the left hemisphere when this kind of thing happens. What it is more than being a left versus right thing. It's more about a higher, more self-conscious mind and a less conscious mind. So there are many areas, many areas in life where we perform better if we're not hyper-aware of ourselves in the doing of it. So, for example, too much awareness of your fingers, if you're trying to play the piano, will stop you from playing. So, yes, at some stage you need to be aware of it, but when you're performing, you need to be able to forget it. I don't know if you remember or came across this bit, but in The Matter with Things, I talk about sports people and their ability to do things better when they relax and when they're not thinking about it. I give a particular example, which is extraordinary, of the TT race, which is this remarkable, probably the dangerous sports event in the world in which people drive over a 62-mile route over mountains along the public road, not in an arena. So you've got all the things that happen on a public road. You've got potholes, you've got sharp bends, you've got walls, you've got whatever going on, but you've got to be driving, and sometimes at nearly 200 miles an hour. How is this done? And the answer is that they enter into a mind state in which they are extremely aware, but with a global awareness. I imagine it's like the sort of awareness that kind of meditating would be intending you to produce, the opposite of sleep, being alert, but not distracted. And these riders, one of them was doing a course and he thought, he had to stop and attend to something with his bike. And he thought, now I've lost it. So he just got back on his bike and just drove to the end of the course. And he beat the record. So in fact, being more relaxed about it helped him. So when we are too focused on something, we are employing the left hemisphere negatively. I think the left hemisphere is capable of being very critical, particularly of other people. It tends to have a rather high opinion of of oneself. When you separate the two hemispheres and give them a personality inventory, and you can do this artificially by sedating one half of the brain at a time for about 15 to 20 minutes. When the left hemisphere alone is answering the questions about itself, it appears to have a very high opinion of itself and of its talents. And when the right hemisphere is asked, it has a much more realistic picture, but slightly on the negative side. So that compared with friends and relations, the story told by the left hemisphere is ridiculously hyped up, but the story by the right hemisphere is a little bit on the kind of, no, you're better than that.
So a little bit of the ego, an inflated ego, is maybe a telltale sign that, we're maybe a little left hemisphere. Or
absolutely, yes, okay. I think that is right.
I was going to ask you if there was a way to tap into the right brain or let it lead. And one of the things you wrote about was that meditation helps put the left hemisphere back in the box by giving it something empty to focus on. So there are some things that one can do for this phenomena. Is that right?
There certainly are, and some of them would be meditation and mindfulness. I look at an account of mindfulness by an acknowledged Tibetan expert, mindfulness meditation, and I point to 23 things that he says that show that it's more right hemisphere mediated than left. Unfortunately, we actually have measurements of parts of the brain that grow in the right hemisphere in repeat meditators, and we know something about the hemispheric balance during meditation. And much of what is going on is trying to still the left hemisphere's monkey mind, chattering all the time, formulating, saying, I know what this is. Yes, I understand it. Having an opinion about it, expressing it rather than allowing it to be what it is, and perhaps seeing something new. because it's only when you allow something else to speak to you that you have experience of something new. Otherwise, all you do is experience your own story about everything over and over again.
So I have a personal question. I had a friend of mine who just passed away just a couple of weeks ago. He had a stroke, Ian, and it was left hemisphere stroke. This person was an articulate speaker and athlete and just a wonderful man, but he got very, very depressed. Now, that's not surprising given a stroke, just because of he had to go to rehab and all that. But something cracked open that he wasn't an emotional person. All of a sudden, he became very emotional. He would cry at the drop of the hat. Anxiety was a bit high. Just there was a tweak to his personality, it seemed like. And this became too much. It's and not being in his shoes, but just, being very close to him, that at some point he committed suicide. And I was just curious as to if there could be some phenomena where the right hemisphere is lit up so much so that emotions and other things the big picture maybe becomes overwhelming. I don't know. Is this common, or is there that risk with that type of brain damage?
It's a difficult one because there is no, unfortunately, simple, quick answer.
Sure.
After damage to subcortical areas in either hemisphere, you can get a kind of disinhibition of emotion in which people become openly tearful and far more expressive of emotion. It's true. It's also true in a different sense that the right hemisphere is probably over-dominant in some kinds of depression. The trouble with depression is that it's a ragbag. I mean, there are psychiatrists distinguish between so many different things that are colloquially called depression. But in true major depressive disorder, it seems like the right frontal lobe is over-dominant. And in schizophrenia, it seems like the left frontal lobe is over-dominant. So these conditions are different. So what I'm really saying is, yes, there is a connection between some kinds of depression and the right hemisphere, which is naturally more in touch with feeling, in touch with the body, and in touch with others, and therefore far more empathic. So people feel responsibility for others, they feel guilt towards others, they feel warmth towards others, they feel melancholy for the state of things and the people in the world through their right hemisphere more than their left. So it's not a very clear picture, but one thing I can say is that quite often when people have a right hemisphere stroke, their personality changes very much for the better. And so I report the case of a particular professor who was always very pedantic and never seemed to have much emotional life. And after having a right hemisphere stroke, his wife said, and he himself said, it's amazing. It's like my world has gone into 3 dimensions and has got more color to it. And literally, when the world is seen through the left hemisphere, it becomes flattened and 2-dimensional. So his personality changed and he became a more likable, a more flexible.
He had a right hemisphere stroke.
No, sorry, did I say that? I meant after a left hemisphere stroke. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry to have confused everyone.
Okay, I was like, what? Well,
that was a left hemisphere stroke. Sorry. So what I'm saying there is it's a difficult one to be sure about, but I do address the question overall, are people more depressed after a left hemisphere stroke than after a right hemisphere stroke? And if you put all the research together, it would seem the answer is no.
So you write about the devaluation of emotions and bodily wisdom. So how do you see intuition and gut instinct? Is this a right hemisphere phenomena or what?
I think it largely is.
Okay.
The moment of insight, which psychologists, being the imaginative bunch they are, call the aha moment, is robustly connected with sudden activity in the right superior temporal sulcus and gyrus. And intuitions are switched off too quickly by left hemisphere because instead of allowing the intuition to be, it's busy conceptualizing it, rationalizing it, and so on. Whereas one needs to allow the intuition to sort of come into one's presence. And so it's often the case that I mentioned that scientific and mathematical discoveries are made by intuition, but it's often when the particular individual is not thinking about the matter at all, but simply walking home and looking at the sky or noticing a flower or something. And then, there's the story of Poincaré having an insight at the moment he put his foot on the bus after going shopping, and he'd solved a problem he'd been looking at for a couple of weeks, but in reality for many weeks and months longer than that. So intuition is more like that. And I want to just say about emotion. Obviously, emotion is not always a good thing any more than reason. And fortunately, there isn't a divide that the right hemisphere does emotion and the left does reason. Both are involved in reason, important parts of reason. In fact, the understanding of a picture overall and what a statement means and things like that are dealt with by the right hemisphere more than the left. But also the right hemisphere is able to be the one that sees the larger picture and is therefore able to inhibit inappropriate emotion. So when there's a sort of left hemisphere overdrive situation, often people become emotional in an entirely inappropriate and extreme way. They have extreme expressions of emotion. And it is the right hemisphere that both grounds deeper emotions, less sort of self-related and social and performative emotions. It grounds those deeper emotions, the maturer emotions, and it also is the ground of inhibiting inappropriate emotion. So when you start looking at this picture, it's never as simple as the sound bites make it. But overall, it remains true that the right hemisphere sees far more, is far more reliable as a witness to what is going on in the world than the left. And once one sees that so much of what we're doing is left hemisphere driven, we can then begin to inhibit it and automatically say, what is this way of thinking stopping me from seeing? I think that is a very important
that's
question.
good.
Okay, so I think this, but what is the way I'm thinking now stopping me from seeing? There is so much that the left hemisphere way of thinking just rules out. As I've said, it's not good at understanding value or deep meaning or any of those things or the purpose of things. It is simply registering data and saying, well, we can use that or we can grab that and we can have more of that. That's slightly exaggerated, but it is, broadly speaking, it's what's going on. And so when we see we're adopting extreme positions, we're adopting over rigid bureaucratic ways of thinking, we're not allowing people to think, let's invert what we believe here and see what comes of that for a while. I believe that in government, there should be a department of inverse policy. So the government say, well, this is our policy. And there should be a publicly funded body that says, if you go down this path, look at what's going to happen. I believe actually that in the Israeli Knesset, there is an advocatus diaboli who says, if you do, this is what will happen. And it's what's he called, Daniel Kahneman calls a pre-mortem. So before adopting a path and before you end
reverse engineer,
a dead one, have a think about what is likely to go wrong, not what you think is going to go well. So that is a good principle. Doubt your assumptions. Think, has the other person got a point of view here? Because there are probably many ways of thinking about this. The same object viewed from a different angle can be a sphere or a cube or a triangle. Somebody just sent me one in the post, and believe me, it does. So it's not that there is, it goes back to my view. What is the real mountain? The real mountain is many, many, many things. If you think of it as only this, then you are missing many other aspects. And so to be objective about something is not a kind of exercise in taking a real living human being out of the picture. What would be the point in that? A real human living being is the only way in which we can understand that picture. Instead, what objectivity is seeing as many different facets of this as possible. I've just come back from Japan, where there's a famous garden, a Zen garden with gravel and rocks. And it has 15 rocks in it, but there is nowhere in the garden from which you can see all 15. You have to move your point of view to be able to see them all. I think that's a nice metaphor for being more flexible, trying a different approach altogether, not closing down too much on something too early on. Don't go, this is what we're driving for. This is what we need. Make sure you do it. Also make sure that somebody else is thinking quite differently, and create an atmosphere, if you're in a team, where you welcome people who say things that you don't particularly want to hear right now, that this is going to lead to various problems. It's much better to know about those problems and get a wiser and cleverer course of action and a preferred outcome.
Be open-minded. Yeah.
Be open-minded, yes.
So I'm very curious as to, so I had Christoph Koch on, and
yes,
he was fantastic, and we talked a lot about consciousness. And it was quite stunning, at the end of our conversation, where his view of consciousness was one of, we're tributaries, basically, of this universal consciousness. And this is coming from a hard scientist. It's fascinating, and I love the mystery of it all. How do the hemispheres handle consciousness, and what is your view of consciousness? I'm asking that. I think I know what your view is, but I just want to...
Yes. Well, I think it's the second part of that we should focus on, because I've really addressed already that the difference in the way they, if you like to put it that way, handle consciousness, is that they do so with different values, different goals, and different kinds of attention, therefore, and produce, as a result, a different phenomenological world, a different experiential world. So what is consciousness? Well, as you know, I've written about this, and in a way, the whole argument of the matter with things, which is a very long book, is to try and unfold this in the context of everything we know about ourselves and the world, through science, through the humanities, through theology, through whatever we wish to name as an important source. And the end of that, and I can unpack why I say this if you want and if you have time, but to cut to the chase, I think that consciousness cannot be said to derive from the brain. In fact, I don't think it can derive from anything. In other words, it is what philosophers call an ontological primitive. That's to say, it is the fundamental nature of being, and you can't go behind it, beyond it, and say what caused that. This is, consciousness is the stuff of the universe, of the cosmos. This is what I believe. And I'm not at all alone in this. In fact, I think probably more physicists of the last 100 years than not would agree with something like that. And of course, it is part of the ancient wisdom of certain traditions of thought around the world, particularly in the East. So what is its relationship with matter? Well, I don't think that the brain can give rise to it. It can't emit it. It might transmit it, but really rather more, I think it permits it. That's to say, it shapes consciousness. It permits it in the sense that it allows certain things in the vast field, infinite field of consciousness, to become present for the time being, for the moment at which one is examining. William James is a very great thinker, I believe, and he had a good image of this, which is the larynx and its relationship to the lungs and voice. The lungs push out air, but if there was no larynx, although his voice is an expression of air, he would have no voice. There would be nothing, just air coming out of him. But because the larynx obstructs the flow of the air, it causes him to have a voice and for him to have a uniqueness in that voice. Now, I think your experience, my experience, is like that, in that there is a vast field of consciousness which the brain is able to sculpt, to mold, to filter, so that certain things are made present to us. And we can alter that in part by the way we use our brains, the way we use our minds. But that is what is happening. And I think when we're here, we don't know that we are connected to that bigger field of consciousness, except under certain circumstances. Some of these religious, some of these meditative, some of these through experimentation with. But in any case, I believe that it's something like this. If you imagine a cell, a single cell, perhaps something like an amoeba that you've seen under the microscope, and it has these outpouchings which enable it to move and to take things in and so on. Now, if you were in the cytoplasm of that amoeba in one of these outpouchings, you would think that you were completely enclosed. All around you, there seemed to be a membrane. But actually, at the foot of the membrane, unless you looked at that very small part, you wouldn't see that, in fact, you're connected completely with the rest of the cytoplasm in the cell, and actually through that to many other cells and so forth. So I believe that is our position, that we are, if you like, divided from one another, but not in the sense of a sharp and hard division. We're separate, we're distinct is the best way of putting it. We're distinct. We have distinct character, distinct being. We are ourselves, but we are also part of something bigger. And it's a mistake to think of any of these distinctions as being hard and fast and unbridgeable. They're all bridged. So that's what I think. And consciousness is, what is consciousness's relationship to matter? Again, to cut to the chase, I think there are all kinds of ways of conceiving it, but I believe that matter is not ultimately separate from consciousness, but in fact, a way in which consciousness can manifest. So consciousness can manifest in a certain way in which it comes and goes from my mind. It has no permanence. As soon as a thought occurs, it's fading, and it has no impediment to going anywhere I like. I can think anything. I can think anything I like. It doesn't guarantee that it actually exists or that it's real. Now, what I think matter is a form consciousness can take in which it does two important things. One is it gives more permanence to the manifestation, and the other is it provides necessary resistance. What I mean by that is a thought is a thought, and I can make it go anywhere. But this table that I'm sitting at resists my hand. Much as I may want to put my hand, I can imagine doing it, but I can't actually put it through the table. So this is actually very helpful. I mean, what is friction? Friction is what stops motion. That's what every physicist will tell you. But friction is also what starts motion. I can't actually move in a world which has no friction. So a degree of resistance is what enables us to move, and to move our mental furniture as well, to move to a different position. So encountering something that is, as it were, oppositional is a great gift. We think that everything must be all one and all together and so on. But no, what one wants is a harmony. And a harmony is not of sameness, but is of difference. It's just not a cacophony, which is when difference is fighting. But when the difference is aligned, it hasn't threatened the integrity of the whole. It has enhanced the integrity of the whole. So that the unison has been enhanced by the harmony. When a bud unfolds, it hasn't destroyed the flower. It's made the flower by unfolding all the parts that are in it. It's individuated, but by individuating, it is still something integral. And that something integral goes on to be part of an even bigger picture at another level. So those are some of my thoughts about matter and consciousness.
That's beautiful. I was going to dovetail into ask your opinion about AI, but the more I talk to you, it seems that your concern is more that we are turning into machines ourselves, or a machine-like
Absolutely.
way of being.
There's no way that a machine can be a person. There are ways in which machines can get better and better at imitating, representing a person, which is typical left hemisphere. But it no more is a person than the image of you and your room on this screen is you and your room. It just is an image of it for the time being. So I don't think that it is possible for machines to become people, but I do think it's possible for people to become like machines, so like machines that they lose their human quality. And it's happening, I believe, quite fast. And you can see it in the language people use. They talk about uploading things to their memory stores or downloading things from I don't know where. They talk about data banks, they talk about all these things which are derived from mechanisms. And I think it is the great war on life, on nature, and on all that we have been given by being living beings in an awe-inspiring cosmos. All that value is destroyed when we start thinking of ourselves as machines. I believe that's a battle, a spiritual battle between the forces for mechanism and the forces for life. The opposite of life is not death. Death is the fulfillment of a life and enables further life. But the opposite of life is mechanism, the machine.
What's wonderful about your works in these books, Master and the Emissary specifically, but the others as well, is that it's almost a theory of everything, sort of. Like it weaves, you can kind of see historical events. You could see tribalism. You could see politics. Again, we go back to insight. This just like, oh, aha, this is what's happening. Now, Iain, you didn't tell me what we could do. Is there anything that we could do?
I think there's a number of levels on which one can do something. One can be part of important movements that do something to help slow down and, if possible, reverse the destruction we've wrought on the planet and on human society, I think, which has been damaged very badly in the last 100 years. That is one level. Another is by doing something that my friend Dougal Hine calls At Work in the Ruins. And he wrote a book called At Work in the Ruins. And what he's basically saying is this civilization will likely not survive. With luck, not all life, and perhaps not all human life, will be wiped out. What can we do to create hubs that can be the growing points, the nodes that will disseminate a new way of being in the world? So these are people who found small groups who further very important ideas, and I belong to and am a patron of, or whatever, a number of these groups. If you like, we can model what a good society of the future would look like, one in which it would need to be small groups to begin with, small enough that people would know one another, be able to trust one another, and work together in a modest way for the fulfillment of our needs and be respectful of the natural world and of one another, rather than, as we seem at the moment, to be determined to do down and destroy the world and other people. So that's the second level. But I think the third one is the most important of all, and fortunately it's the easiest of all, which is to work on oneself. G.K. Chesterton said a long time ago, what is the matter with the world? And he answered, I am. And in a way, what we need to do is to start changing the way we ourselves think, move, and are in the world. So change our mode of being. And that's something we can begin. It's not an overwhelming task. People say, oh, but I'm so small and the world is so big, and what's the point? Well, there's a very great deal of point, because first of all, when it comes to the realm of value and purpose and meaning and love and creativity, there is no large and small anymore. If you really love somebody, the only way you can talk about it is, my love is as deep as the ocean, as wide as the heaven, whatever it is. But what is it really? It's not a good question. That's a left hemisphere question. How big is it? But it is powerful and important. And it has been said that if only 3% of people begin to think in a different way, this can be the beginnings of something like a renaissance. And that is what we need very urgently. And it can't be done without working on yourself. Because as I think we touched on earlier, if you don't change yourself and change the way you think, having a list of things to do will not make any difference. So it is up to each person who is listening to this or watching it to begin now, not tomorrow, to work on how we think, how we look at the world. And this is enormously fulfilling for the self, one will start to live a happier, more contented, less perhaps acquisitive, less perhaps overweening kind of life. But one will also be doing good by simply having done this. It is what our lives are for, in my view. Whitehead raised the question, why is there life? And it is an interesting question, because the sort of answer is it enables one entity to sort of compete to outdo another one. And that's the way we think of evolution. But quite apart from anything else, evolution is as much about cooperation as it is about competition. Both are necessary. And those that have survived and succeeded have been those that have known how to cooperate. But when you look at the history of evolution, we haven't got better at surviving. If survival is what you want, persistence in being is what you need, then never be alive at all. So what I think it's about is that the cosmos has, as I say, as part of its nature, a desire for creativity. It is a creative cosmos, let me put it less anthropomorphically. It is furthering creation. It starts from this tiny blob of stuff, and it is the whole unbelievable panoply of the universe has come from that, and all the differentiations that we see. So I believe that is what it is for. I believe that, as in common with many traditions, that its nature is love, in the sense that that creativity is about bringing something about, and love is relational. Love is nothing if it is not relational, and it must have a relation, therefore, with something that is not completely consumed and assumed and consumed by the loving entity. And I believe that is what we are here for, that we have evolved to be these remarkable beings that are capable of appreciating goodness, beauty, and truth. And I don't think only humans can do this. I think that animals appreciate beauty and probably goodness. Certainly the great apes do. They can act in an entirely selfless way, and so forth. So what I'm really saying is that we are there to further these elements in the cosmos, and by responding to them and by creatively devoting our attention to them. So that's where each one of us can go today, now, to devote ourselves to a life which is more attuned to what is true, what is good, and what is beautiful.
Amen. With that, I think that's a good place to stop. Iain, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much. Is there another book? You've said it all, or?
There may be another book, but I hope there will never be another long book. I feel it's a terrific imposition on humanity to write long books. I'd like to write a short book.
So people can find you. So you had a website. Now it's, I think, the Iain McGilchrist channel, I believe. So you're everywhere.
It's called channelmcgilchrist.com. And that gives you stuff about me, and you don't need to be a member to enter and to see much that is relevant. If you want to become a member, you get certain other things, but it's largely something designed to be open to anyone who's curious.
Yeah, I want to encourage everybody to go there and check it out. There's some wonderful writing, and then there's also more interviews and what have you, plus the books.
Yes.
And like I said, I'm going to, Iain, put these in our show notes. Is there anything else? That was a great exclamation point there at the end, but is there anything else that we didn't discuss that you would want to say?
There's just about all the rest of the universe and to talk about.
Well, that's a wrap. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed it, do share it with your friends and on your social platforms. Big thanks to Sam Williams, my audio guy, and the beautiful bumper music you're hearing is Michael Petrovich's Bella Luna. For all my show notes or resource links, visit LarryWeeks.com, and we will talk again soon.